If you grew up playing with superhero action figures when you were a child, you will have undoubtedly seen, or perhaps even have been lucky enough to own, the various playsets and vehicles that some of these toy lines provided. There's something immensely fun about building the world of these superheroes with these playsets and the vehicles, and having them being able to move around and interact in a much larger environment. And it's good news for toy companies because that means they get to put out products in a much larger scale at a much higher price point. And this approach works very well, especially when you have a character like Batman who naturally has all these various vehicles and playsets that we see in the source material, in the comics, in the movies, the TV shows. It's a very organic and authentic approach to then apply this to the toy line as well, except for the times and the characters when it isn't natural or organic or even appropriate. Because in those circumstances, these vehicles will feel at best like a cynical cash-in and at worst an absolute joke. And they're the ones I want to shine the spotlight on today. Okay, it's in the thumbnail and it's probably the most famous example of crass commercialism to sell toys. And that is, of course, the Spider-Mobile. Now, I'm putting this down as a theme, as opposed to just being a specific vehicle from one toy company, because a lot of toy companies have done this. The earliest example I can find of this is from Mego or Mego back in the 1970s, and of course we have that wonderful commentary of that in the actual comic books themselves. Because of course, in those self-same comic books, Spider-Man was gifted a Spider-Mobile, and Spider-Man lampoons it for all that it's worth. And the reason behind this was because this idea was mandated from the executives at Marvel to sell toys. And the writers quite rightly saw through this and realised just how ridiculous it was that Spider-Man of all characters would be given any kind of vehicle to drive around in, since he's so much faster to just web swing. And so they cleverly decided to take a tongue-in-cheek approach to introducing this in their comic books. And so, in a way, it's somewhat authentic that we do have all these various spider cars across the years. Although, interestingly, very few of them bear any resemblance to the actual Spider-Mobile in the comic books. But despite being completely unnecessary and a very obvious, crass bit of toy marketing, they've continued to produce spider cars across many, many years. In the 90s, we saw a proliferation of various Spider-Mobiles. Some looked quite cool, but they never really got away from the idea of being completely redundant in Spider-Man's universe, although they would try and work in various spider elements by giving them spider legs and spider grapples and things like this. But the idea, and I can only assume the sales, persisted because they continued with this into the 2000s. We saw multiple Spider-Man lines, even once we got into the Marvel Legends era of action figures. We're still producing spider cars for Spider-Man to drive. Some were more like sports cars, whilst others still maintained that spider-ish quality. But they even produced cars for the Spider-Man 2 movie and Spider-Man 3, which only further highlights the ridiculousness of this concept because, of course, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man never drives a car in any of those films. Next up, I have Captain America's Turbo Coupe. This offering is from Toy Biz from the very early 90s, and on the face of it, I can understand the impulse to give Captain America a vehicle. After all, it's not so ridiculous. Captain America certainly has super speed and super strength, but he might need some help getting from A to B. Plus, he's no stranger to piloting the Quinjet or riding a motorcycle, as we've seen in the comic books for decades. But sadly, rather than drawing on from one of those examples, Toy Biz decided to take their own creative approach and create a vehicle for Captain America, and hence we have the Turbo Coupe, which, to be honest, is more of a cross between a Transformer and the Batmobile. Of course, it has all these multiple action features. It fires his shield as a missile. It opens up to reveal a mini cockpit that doubles as a sort of helicopter, or possibly ejector seat. It's really hard to tell. And of course, it's fully decked out in the star-spangled stars and stripes. So the one thing we can guarantee is that Cap is not using this for any stealth missions. So whilst the idea isn't inherently awful, I think the execution is a bit cringeworthy. And in my experience, that is often the case when toy companies decide to stray away from the source material and create something or invent something entirely new that may be very toyetic, but it doesn't really fit and doesn't really feel organic to these characters. In the very same lineup, we'd also get another Spider-Mobile variant, which would be the Spider-Man Dragster. Again, we have this very strange looking vehicle that fires various bits and pieces. It seems to fire a sort of web missile from the front of the vehicle, which kind of makes sense, I suppose. What really throws me, though, is the helicopter blades that just fire off into the air for no real reason, as far as I can tell. As Stan Lee would say, "'Nuff said." Okay, just to show that it's not only Marvel that suffered with some of these issues, DC have had their fair share of problems too. And surprisingly, one example is the Kenner line for Batman Returns. Now, this might be surprising since they had such legitimate source material to draw upon to build a whole world of vehicles and playsets around, but unfortunately they decided to get a little bit creative here as well, and so we get the introduction of things like Robin's jet foil cycle. This is kind of weird straight off the bat since Robin isn't in Batman Returns, so it does seem like a strange character introduced, let alone give him his own vehicle for this line. But that aside, rather than giving him a realistic vehicle that we see in the comic books, like his motorcycle for example, they've decided to create this hovercraft, jet ski kind of thing. Once again, the concept of stealth has gone out the window because this is very brightly coloured in the Robin colours. We have a bright red, green and yellow on display here, so he's not sneaking up on any criminals. It fires a missile with a string attached. I'm guessing the idea is to tie up enemies, perhaps? And it's just big enough to carry himself and Batman if Batman wants to join him on a ride. Yeah, a pretty strange thing that obviously has never been seen in comic books or movies or any Batman media before or since, and with good reason. This line is also notable, of course, for giving us the Penguin umbrella jet, which I did cover in a previous Weird and Wonderful, otherwise it would have made it onto this list. Okay, back to Spider-Man now. As if the Spider-Mobile wasn't ridiculous enough, they've also given Spider-Man a lot of spider cycles across the year. That is, of course, motorcycles or motorbikes. Once again, this is an idea that's been recycled many times across the years. Spider-Man's had multiple motorbikes now in toy form, some leaning more heavily into the spider theme more than others, and there's been flirtation with various different styles and makes of motorcycle, but all of them completely unnecessary. And again, this isn't something that was limited just to a specific time period, say the 90s, which was known for experimentation and of course being a little bit out there when it came to certain creative choices. This continued right the way into the early 2000s and still happens today with the release of various films. I personally find this spider chopper from Spider-Man 2 very funny because it's so antithetical to Spider-Man's life in that film. To their credit, Toy Biz did release another Spider-Man with motorbike, or should I say scooter, for Spider-Man 2 that does accurately reflect the kind of vehicle that Peter Parker rides around in that film. But the key difference here, of course, is that it is Peter Parker and not Spider-Man that rides around on the scooter. Again, Spider-Man doesn't need a vehicle to get around New York City. So this is a particularly odd release, and I think what was happening here was that they were struggling to find ways to sell Spider-Man figures in this line because they only really had Spider-Man, Mary Jane and Doc Ock as major characters in Spider-Man 2 to sell. And once you've made those figures, how do you continue to build that line and maximise and capitalise on sales? Well, they had to find new gimmicks to try and sell Spider-Man over and over and over again, and this is probably one of the weakest ones in that Spider-Man with a Tobey Maguire head and his pizzas and scooter from Spider-Man 2, which is a pretty weird look when you put it all together. Sticking with Toy Biz for a moment, the X-Men are a set of characters much like Batman in that their world naturally opens the doors to all sorts of fantastic vehicles and larger-than-life playsets, and if Sentinels, Danger Rooms and X-Jets aren't enough, you can take characters like Wolverine and give him his motorcycle. Again, all totally in keeping with what we see in the source material and absolutely fine. But this X-Men Mutant Racer Wolverine assault vehicle definitely raises more questions than it answers. When did Wolverine get this sports car? Why would Wolverine be driving this sports car? Why does it have assault weaponry? And it is called the Mutant Racer, so is Wolverine now racing on the weekend in his spare time? This all looks and feels very out of character. Even the paint deco doesn't really match up with Wolverine's colours. Not that it has to, but it does feel a little bit odd. They've given a brand new costume for this vehicle as well, so he's got matching duds. But again, this only really serves to highlight how strange this is and how out of touch it is with the character and the source material. Number 5 just goes to show that even a toy company like McFarlane Toys was not immune from this syndrome, because they too would also exploit their own characters in the Spawn universe to create really unfitting and unnecessary vehicles for them to ride around in. And if ever there were characters that didn't need vehicles, it would be the supernatural characters, and they don't get much more supernatural than Spawn and Violator, and yet Spawn was gifted with his own Spawnmobile, which is pretty ridiculous, but for my money doesn't come anywhere near the Violator chopper. Now, credit where credit is due, these do look like pretty toyetic toys. They look pretty fun and interesting, and the artwork on the packaging is really cool. And I like that they also went to the effort of illustrating these for their own comic book that came in packaged with the toys, to just give them that little bit more hint of legitimacy. But hands down, my favourite has to be the Violator monster rig. At least this does feel quite fresh and original. And I think even now there's something kind of fun about these vehicles. They just don't really belong in the Spawn universe. Back to DC now with the Supermobile, and again there's been a number of different versions of this across the years, but the idea does persist, and just like Marvel with the Spider-Man Spider Buggy or the Spider-Mobile, this was also shoehorned into the comic books as well, so at least there is that sense of legitimacy to it, but obviously it's a cash grab and it's a ridiculous concept. Of all the superheroes in any comic book anywhere, Superman is the one who is virtually limitless in terms of his power. The guy can fly, he can breathe underwater, in outer space, he can run faster than a speeding bullet. This guy does not need any support or any transport to get him to go anywhere in the universe. And yet that didn't stop them coming up with the Supermobile, a pretty strange contraption that in the comic book actually has fists on either side that stretch out and punch his villains, which is pretty special. But I have to say, this release from the Superpowers line from Kenner is pretty disappointing in that sense. It's fairly nondescript. It doesn't really have an awful lot going on in it. It's essentially just a giant cockpit that you can sit Superman in. It doesn't really have that much in the way of action features, and it doesn't look that spectacular, really. So I'm not sure what Superman's getting out of this. I can certainly see why he ditches this in favour of the Matrix Conversion Coupe. This is the kind of thing that might have actually worked for Captain America. It is essentially a sports car that transforms into a flying vehicle that can fly off into space. This is kind of cool. Again, for Superman, not really necessary. And as far as maintaining the secret identity, having the big S logo on the front of the vehicle might give things away. But it's not just Superman who's doing this, we also see it with Superboy as well, who has his VTOL cycle, which I gather must be pretty intense to ride since he does have a gas mask on there as well, so yeah, this must go at some high velocity that even Superboy can't cope with. At number 3 we have repeat offender Mego with the Hulk Explorer. This was made for the 3 3/4 inch scale line that they produced at the time, and was an attempt by Mego to repurpose their Micronauts line for the superheroes. Hulk was by no means alone. We did see another Spider-Mobile, a Bat Shuttle, a Robin Shuttle, but of all of them, I think it's the Hulk Explorer that is the funniest and probably most outrageous. Again, this is a character that isn't well suited to being in any vehicle, since his primary purpose is to smash things up with his terrible temper. There's something wonderfully surreal and strange about seeing the Hulk in this vehicle. It just doesn't look natural or right. It's definitely something out of a fever dream, but the illustration on the package is absolutely magnificent. I think that makes it worthwhile alone. Seeing Hulk in a state of ecstasy or absolute agony, I can't tell, but either way, it's definitely an image that will stay with you. Now, as much as possible for this list, I've tried to stay away from preschool items. Whilst a lot of them can be pretty funny to the adult eye, you can see they've been made with a different audience in mind, and to a certain degree I think they deserve a certain amount of latitude to be given when it comes to making creative choices for very, very young infants. But one example I did want to draw on is the Marx line of scooters. Marx were one of the earliest toy companies to make toys based on the Marvel Comics characters, and I think it's probably fair to say that they didn't quite understand the characters they had licensed to. They'd already had great success taking children's properties, Disney characters and whatnot, producing a series of cutesy scooter vehicles which can be pulled back and let go to let them ride. And I think they must have thought that they could apply the same logic to these new characters they just acquired, seen largely as children's characters. Except, well, the Marvel Universe doesn't look so great when it's on a pink scooter. So, while Spider-Man and Captain America look fairly ridiculous on a pink scooter like this, it's hard to imagine them being seen there driving one of these. The worst example, the most egregious one, is of course Thor, who far and away looks the silliest, and of course is the most unlikely of any of these characters to be riding a scooter. So at number 1, my all-time favourite, it is of course the Superpowers line from Kenner, Justice Jogger. This toy is bizarre on so many levels, and the reason it has to be number 1 is just because it's unlike anything else out there. Sure, we've seen crass tie-ins when it comes to cars, motorcycles, hey, there's a whole subset of helicopters out there as well. But this is the first and only time I've ever seen a chicken walker. What a weird conception. This is essentially a wind-up toy that slowly walks forwards in one direction. It's small, ungainly, not particularly attractive, and utterly impractical. What puts it over the edge is the fact that they've made this for Superman, and as I've already touched on earlier in this video, Superman, of all the superheroes, does not need transportation. And if he did, let's say he lost all of his powers, became mortal, maybe that was a storyline that was running, then surely he could opt for any number of ordinary vehicles or more practical vehicles. It's hard to imagine a scenario where this one specific vehicle would come in handy. To make matters worse, they have a selling feature of the yellow sunroof which can come down and just make the thing look even weirder. What's more, even the action figure of Superman looks very uncomfortable and slightly annoyed to be seen in this thing. I never thought I'd ever have to feel sorry for Superman, but I do now. And so there you have it. There is a top 10 countdown of the most unnecessary vehicles that have been given to action figures across the years. This was a pretty tricky list to narrow down to 10. There was an awful lot that I let slide, but do let me know in the comments if you think there are other entries that would have been more worthy to be in the top 10 spot. It's always really fun to find out about other toys that should have been on these lists. As ever, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the vid, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.